Do you remember the Dark Ages? No, I'm not talking about onagers or siege towers or stupid people in silly castles citing idiotic doctrines to justify a war which lasted over 100 years. I meant the Dark Ages of online historical discussions, back in the day, the early 2000s, when it was largely relegated to internet forums and the comment sections of YouTube videos. In these times, a special breed of pseudo-historian flourished, the wereaboo. The wereaboo was a specific result of a specific combination of very specific factors in the way history was approached up until the early 2010s. A lot of the history surrounding World War II was from a strongly American-centric perspective. This is due to a variety of factors, but the general gist in pop culture was that Hitler nearly conquered Europe, and the Americans saved the day, and rarely the, quote, Russians got a mention. Yes, the Russians, not the Soviets, who are a vast and multi-ethnic demographic of Ukrainians and Belarusians and the rest, but the Russians. As we should all know by now, erasing non-Russians from their own history is a dangerous thing to do, but nobody really cared at the time. As a result, there were huge knowledge gaps about the war, especially of the Eastern Front, which were worsened when some of the more popular sources of disinformation were Cold War era memoirs from former Nazis, who have no political motivation to rewrite history at all. Nope. Spear, slavery, hardly knew her. As a result of this dodgy history, despite the works of historians like Richard J. Evans trying to control and mitigate, the damage was immense. The wereaboo, these days, is mostly extinct. Better history becoming more widely available meant that minds got changed, and the period of the 2010s onwards was that of steady correction to a more balanced view. Germany certainly had advantages in the first 2 years of the war, but these were quickly spent, and the resources of Germany were unable to keep up with that of the Allies, which included the Soviets at the time. Therefore, Germany's defeat was inevitable. Personally, due to the large knowledge gaps surrounding the Eastern Front, upon discovering the contributions the Soviets made to the war, I became what is known as a tankie. No, I wasn't a social chauvinist. I was the kind who thought that the T-34, no, not that one, yeah, that one, was the best thing since sliced bread, and that if only Stalin did a few things differently, the war would have gone the other way. Structural factors be damned. Not my finest moment. Of course, upon gaining access to better sources and better history, I have come to a more nuanced and grounded position. The Red Army was the only standing army in Europe from 1941 to 1943 which had the capability of fighting the Nazis in Europe. However, they needed significant help from the rest of the Allies in terms of Lend-Lease in order to make many of their victories from 1941 to 1943 possible. Lend-Lease nor, quote, General Winter were not the only factors which led to the Soviets' victories. They also had competent generals, a dark truth which some people might not want you to know about. The reason this keeps happening is because a lot of people, even today, are drawn to history which cares more for the story it is trying to sell rather than recounting and analysing the past in a scholastic manner. That is to say, pop history. It can be very simple and very engaging, which is why it appeals to a broad range of people, especially children. Why do you think so many wereaboos were young and impressionable teens with unrestricted internet access? The History Channel, nowadays, is a name so notorious to modern historians that it is synonymous with tuberculosis in the year 1807. What was once a watchable television channel hosting decent documentaries with serviceable facts now stands as a paragon of ancient aliens conspiracy bullshit and boring reality television. No, I don't care about pawn shops. Nobody does. A lot of television was like this back then. Nazi megastructures on National Geographic, while far more grounded than Ancient Aliens, still heavily carried the notion of Nazi technological supremacy. After all, they made the Gustav gun, which could only fire a few times before the barrel needed to be replaced, or the Bismarck, which only conducted one offensive operation before it was sunk, or the litany of large and very expensive static defences, like in Normandy, which proved incapable in the face of large mobile operations, like in World War II. The thing about the History Channel or shows like Nazi Megastructures is that they were or presented themselves as documentaries. When you make a documentary, you spend a lot of time and money filming, post-producing and hiring an animator to make the Gustav gun fire at a poor and unsuspecting French village. But there is a reason documentaries take a while as well. Research needs to be done. They are also often passed by academics to ensure that the work is accurate, basic facts and the like. If these were made at a much greater rate, like with Ancient Aliens, things get sloppy and very basic errors are made. In the age of skepticism that we live in, we tend to have a more critical eye with these sorts of things. Call Me Ezekiel is a YouTuber who started off his career making historical content through the medium of Crunchyballs, or Poland Ball, and this garnered him quite a large follower base, and he's been doing it ever since. He also does libertarian political science too sometimes. He has a pretty good upload schedule which he abides by, anything from a couple of weeks to a month, and his videos have steadily increased in production quality. But there is a pretty big issue. Ezekiel has a habit of viewing history through a strong ideological lens. I just want to preface now that there is nothing wrong with having a political opinion and using it to develop your understanding of history. An unopinionated historian is a boring one, and a bad communicator at that. But I want you to pay close attention to a video they made 2 years ago surrounding the Freikorps. This video has red flags for me from the get-go. Firstly, there's a description which states, "What happened to Germany after the end of the First World War? A communist revolution, that's what, but it failed because of the Freikorps. Private citizens, war veterans, and patriots who organized private militias to stop the revolution and save Germany from communism. But could such a movement really maintain its discipline and prevent radicalization or civilian casualties? Also, Adolf Hitler almost gets murdered by a pack of ravenous communists." Libertarian jargon aside, private citizens, seriously, it paints a very flattering image of the Freikorps as the ones who, quote, saved Germany from communism. If you're trying to be a historian, this is the sort of taking sides which is best to be avoided, because you are immediately limiting the scope of your analysis. I'm not saying you need to sit on the fence, you only get splinters up your ass. What I am saying is that there needs to be some sort of balance, treating all sides with the same level of scrutiny. His first source is from a man named Nigel Jones, a former UKIP member. When you go into the Amazon reviews for his book, you get gold like this. A bad start. His second source is far more serviceable, a small text around the Freikorps, complete with illustration. Two sources for a chronicle of the Freikorps seems awfully lacking to me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Just who were the Freikorps? Well, the Freikorps were far-right, pan-Germanic, ultra-nationalist terrorists who committed broad atrocities across Germany, the Baltics, and even against the Polish at times. The Freikorps were German veterans of the First World War who often used violence to get what they wanted. In fact, they were even tied to a spree of political assassinations a la the Thiem murders and their association with the organisation Konsul post-Kapp-Putsch dissolution, which was largely made up of former Freikorps members. The organisation was responsible for the assassination of politicians to prepare Germany for a transition towards an ultra-nationalist dictatorship. Bear that in your mind, it will be important, you will start seeing a pattern soon. Now, the video, I won't be able to go through every single point, as then we'd be here literally all day because of my immense autistic fixation on the interwar period. So I'll go through a few highlights and cut a lot of things out. There'll be a link in the description for the video for transparency's sake, to ensure I'm not taking anything out of context.
They arrived just in time, because on the 5th of January, a massive protest was called. The crowd is estimated to have been at least 700,000 people.
The crowd wasn't 700 people, it was closer to 100,000.
The protests soon turned violent, and they seized Berlin's vital newspaper district. It was this increasingly violent situation that Merker and his men would find themselves in. But luckily, they weren't alone.
Ezekiel paints the picture of the Spartacist uprising being an increasingly violent and progressively unstable situation. It wasn't. The vast majority of the people who partook in the Spartacist uprising were unarmed workers. The vast majority of the violence occurred when the government called upon the Freikorps.
Eventually, orders supposedly from the government reached the various units, telling them to retake the newspaper district and other key locations.
Note the way Ezekiel used the word supposedly, as if it's up to interpretation. No dude, we have receipts. Gustav Nosk was notorious for calling upon paramilitaries to put down cases of civil unrest. It worked too. Even the threat of force made many of the striking workers very reluctant to support the Spartacists out of worry of being retaliated against. But with this context, the Freikorps' disproportionate use of force and extrajudicial executions, roughing up as Ezekiel calls it, would seem completely unacceptable, because it was. Ezekiel then tried to downplay Luxemburg's murder by stating,
What happened next is unclear.
Again, we have receipts. She was murdered by the Freikorps. Perhaps the leader of the largest Freikorps unit in the city admitted it in an interview with Der Spiegel. Ezekiel even admits that her body had been weighted down in a body of water.
Her body was discovered 5 months later stuck in a lock of the Landwehr Canal. It had been wired and weighted down with stones.
It is abundantly clear what happened. It was a murder. It should be referred to as a murder, not unclear circumstance. This is a disturbing use of doublespeak that any historian worth their salt ought to avoid. Call Me Ezekiel gives a brief history of the Freikorps' attempt to overthrow the Latvian and the Estonian governments to reform the Baltic Duchy. His account would be fine were it not sparse of details, analysis, or the pretty major knowledge gap. He makes it seem that the Freikorps went into Latvia and Estonia because a German officer was arrested.
Who took action by arresting one of the German officers. They accused him of plotting to overthrow the government.
He didn't say who, and alludes to accusations of a plot to overthrow the government. This specific detail is inaccurate, and I have reason to believe Ezekiel crossed his wires from an upcoming push. The Baltic Freikorps couped Latvia and instated a puppet government, and argued to the British that the excessive Freikorps presence was necessary to ensure the Soviets didn't storm the Baltics. The Freikorps did this because they were pan-German ultranationalists who wanted to establish a German colony in the region, as shown through the presence of German landowners, as Ezekiel cites, as well as cooperation from Baltic German nationalists.
Things proceeded smoothly until a man sporting an unkempt beard attracted the crowd's attention, and thus the Bavarian Soviet Republic was born.
He confused the Free People's State of Bavaria for the Bavarian Soviet Republic. This is a critical error which is avoided by those with even a mere passing knowledge of the German revolutions. I've seen Hoi 4 mods make this mistake, and when you're on the same wavelength as historical fanfiction, then you are doing something wrong.
This strange man's name was Kurt Eisner. Unfortunately, his new regime had some problems. Bavaria's economy was rapidly deteriorating, and food was coming into short supply. After inevitably doing poorly in the scheduled elections, Eisner was assassinated by a rightist.
I also want to note that Kurt Eisner was assassinated on the 21st of February 1919. Ezekiel just says it was a, quote, rightist. It was Anton Graf von Arco-Alpha-Valley, a German far-right ultranationalist with sympathies to the Volkisch movement and the Thule Society. He was a self-proclaimed anti-Semite and would later go on to inspire Joseph Goebbels. The Joseph Goebbels. Are you noticing that pattern yet? Ezekiel made an argument that the country was entering food shortages, but this only became a real issue after Eisner was murdered. I also want to note that Ezekiel chose to present an anti-Semitic hate crime as a Family Guy gag.
This heralded some absolutely absurd leftist infighting, more political violence and assassinations.
I also want to note he mentions assassinations and implies it to be the result of leftist infighting. Almost all of the political violence was carried out by nationalists. Ezekiel then moves on to the actual Bavarian Soviet Republic and commits what I can only chalk up to as a slip of the tongue. He says that the communists and anarchists who formed the SR were sent from Russia.
Eventually, they were all replaced by a crew of professional Bolsheviks sent from Russia.
Which is not true. Eugen Levine had been living in Germany since 1915, and Max Levin, co-founder of the Communist Party of Germany, had been in Germany as early as 1897 for academic reasons. These people merely had Lenin's approval.
It included all the usual land appropriation and robbery.
It is here where Call Me Ezekiel's political bias really shines through. He cannot help but depict the communists as thieves with big bags of loot, when the government wasn't hoarding it. In fact, a lot of the aristocrats' land was given to the homeless.
But the people of the city responded not with horror, but by initiating an orgy of debauchery and bacchanalism.
I also cannot find any verified information about orgies, so I'm confident we can chalk that up to a lie. A lie which was popular among right-wing circles immediately after the fact. He then goes on to say,
the exact kind that would define the Weimar Republic for decades to come.
This is obvious bullshit. In the years 1923 to 1929, Germany's economy went through a miraculous recovery and support for extremist parties dropped in what was the golden age for Germany. This is very basic history which we, in Britain, learn for our GCSEs. It is common knowledge, and only the ignorant or malevolent have anything to gain by painting Weimar Germany as an era of instability and moral decline.
The German state of Bavaria was three things. It was very Catholic, it was very conservative, and it was very, very anti-Semitic.
Another thing we ought to note, obviously Bavaria wasn't as conservative as it would go on to be, otherwise there would not have been as much popular socialist support in the cities. Ezekiel shows a slight rural bias here, which was more Catholic and conservative.
A large number of the men involved in the Munich Revolution, including Kurt Eisner himself, happened to be Jewish. So if putting a bunch of socialist atheist Jews in
I can only find two people who were Jewish in Eisner's cabinet, less for the Soviets. I find it incredibly disconcerting that he decided to draw them snapping a crucifix in half. Eisner made absolutely zero moves on the existing Catholic institutions within Bavaria, and, under the Soviet, only one church was taken by the state. It is hardly the attack on Bavarian culture that Ezekiel is framing it as. Kurt Eisner was not the revolutionary threat he is painted as. Eisner was a socialist and a Marxist at that, but Eisner was a pacifist at heart and deeply cared for women's suffrage and the rights of workers. He was punished at the hands of a future Nazi for being Jewish. Turning around to frame him as a real threat to Bavaria is incredibly callous, and it is disrespectful to him and victims of anti-Semitic violence across the world, as well as playing into the hands of reactionaries.
Their attempt to seize political control would be known as the Cap Push.
At 10 minutes and 30 seconds, Ezekiel moves on to the Cap Putsch.
On the 12th of March, 1920, the coup began with Ehrhardt's brigade marching into Berlin. Some men carried the old imperial banner, while others had swastikas painted on their helmets, although it should be noted that the symbol was not yet associated with the Nazis.
What our good friend Ezekiel either forgot to mention or is entirely unaware of is that the symbol's already in use by far-right German ultranationalists like the aforementioned Volkisch movement. True Deutsch was a major Volkisch publication. The writer was a raging anti-Semite called Heinrich Pudor, who was also a nudist. Brigade Erdhardt put this on their helmets to show their Nordic heritage, and the Volkisch movement and their use of the Hakenkreuz would later go on to inspire Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. If you're noticing a pattern here, it's because there's a pattern here. Ezekiel glosses over the putsch, again very sparse with the details, so I'll do his job for him and fill in the blanks. The Cap Putsch was an attempt by German nationalists to take over the government and reinstate the Kaiserreich in the form of an absolute monarchy. Before all this, many in the Freikorps and other far-right circles were spreading the stab in the back myth, and therefore the government needed to be ousted to restore Germany's former glory, undoing the largely bloodless 1918 revolution. It should be noted that the Iron Division's commanding officer, who was arrested in Germany, not the Baltics, which left the Iron troops leaderless when they arrived in Hamburg. They then machine gun fired into a crowd of civilians, which led to a civilian militia fighting them back, and the Iron troops being sent to an army base to disarm. Maybe that's where Ezekiel got his wires crossed. After Kapp declared himself leader of Germany, there were massive strikes across Germany.
Now, the government knew this was coming. The most important strikers were the government bureaucrats, without whom there was no way to communicate with the Freikorps outside of Berlin.
Ezekiel claims that the government knew about this and that bureaucrats were most important to prevent communications, but he also neglects to mention the equal importance of the overwhelming working class pushback against Kapp, such as the transport workers, effectively ensuring the isolation of the Freikorps in Berlin, as well as the apparent unreadiness of the government indicating they were unaware of the plot. The aftermath of the Kapp Putsch was the Ruhr Uprising, triggered as local military leadership refused to drop their support for Kapp, which led to these local forces brutally clamping down on the strikers. Another detail Ezekiel seemingly forgot is that the courts largely favoured the putschists. Pabst, remember him, Kapp, Erdhardt and Ludendorff got off with light sentences and minor disciplinary actions, and most of the people involved in the putsch were acquitted. The court was not so kind to some of the Ruhr strikers, many of whom received very harsh sentences. Ezekiel accurately states that the Freikorps were a hotbed of violent nationalists and extremists. But there is a problem. He said,
a smaller number of Freikorpsmen would have subscribed to racism and anti-Semitism, but they were mostly present in the later years and concentrated in Bavaria and among the Baltic campaigners.
This is the last point he ends on, and it is tenuous at best. Ezekiel, second before, mentioned the large number of nationalists and future Nazis who were within the Freikorps, but it wasn't just Himmler, Heydrich, Hess and Bormann. If you spotted a pattern, it's because there is a pattern. Host, the guy who ran Auschwitz, was part of the Roschbach division, as was Bormann and Kurt Deluge. Heydrich was a member of the Merker division. Ehrhardt, of the 2nd Marine Brigade, had a long list of far-right terrorism long after the dissolution of the Freikorps. The Epp division, named after the leader Ritter von Epp, had Ernst Röhm, Rudolf Hess, Hans Frank, the guy who ran Nazi-occupied Poland, and the Strasser brothers. The volunteer division of Horse Guards had our good friend Pabst in it. He was the leader, who was friends with Walter Funk, a major Nazi official. Pabst had a militia funded by Mussolini in Austria, and he was later involved with establishing neo-Nazism in the post-war while he stayed in Switzerland. The Horse Guards also had the Heinz Guderian and Gunther Pank, who was the leader of police in wartime Denmark as well as an SS officer. That doesn't even include all the Nazi generals, SS officers, Luftwaffe officers, and future Nazi statesmen who were former members of the Freikorps. That is not a small number or a few bad apples, that is a pattern of behaviour indicative of the Freikorps as a whole. only a small number present in the later years, my foot. At the end of the day, this video hardly counts for history. Aside from 2 sources, basic facts are wrong, critical errors are made, and one cannot help but have the sneaking feeling that he did not know what he was talking about, given the lack of any real analysis. However, this video was made over 2 years ago. Being fair to Ezekiel, we've all made dodgy videos when we didn't have the resources we would go on to have. Especially me, I've made some real stinkers in the past. I would admit that I do not know much about the 55 days in Beijing, but I'm sure his video is fine. After all, his newer work is longer with more sources and a higher production value, and he's still doing it. This video's title is a lie. Stalin did not have a plot to start World War II, nor was he pitting the powers of Europe against each other, like the thumbnail suggests. I understand that it's a catchy title and a very evocative thumbnail, which means more clicks, but it instantly poisons the well. I could disassemble this video too, but this video is already long enough. Instead, I want to bring attention to the first book he cites as a major source. Stalin's War is deserving of a video in of itself, but I'm not going to make it for the sake of my own mental health, at least not now. The book is great as a story, after all it is well written and McMeekin has a strong prose. The book is a bad piece of history. I'm not talking about the citation errors, incorrect dates, misquotes, or using forgeries as sources. I'm talking about the fact that I don't think it's a history book. Why do I think that? Well, at the end of the book, Sean McMeekin writes, "At home, the price Americans paid for this victory was the erosion of their own civil liberties, with a never-expanding security state contrary to the country's founding principles and stated ideals, which bears increasing resemblance to the Soviet version they struggled against." Would a history book with the express intention of focusing on the Soviets end with what is essentially big government bad and drawing parallels between modern Democrats and Stalinist-style communism? Because the book is selling us a story, not history. McMeekin cannot help himself but look at the world through his conservative and American perspective, which leaves us with certified hood classics like this. It also makes sense why Call Me Ezekiel, a right libertarian YouTuber with strong political opinions, would enjoy a book like this. After all, the vast majority of Ezekiel's work is from an American perspective and appeals strongly to anti-Soviet mythology. And I don't mean that in the way he rightfully acknowledges all the awful things Stalin did. I mean that in the way that a lot of his videos surrounding Russo-Soviet history and the surrounding nations therein take a side to sell a story of an over-encumbered Soviet apparatus which was stopped by the little guys like Finland or the Baltics in 1940 and 1919 respectively. Structural reasons and analysis be damned. I do not think that Call Me Ezekiel nor Sean McMeekin are secret Nazis. Far from it. They just have strong opinions and stronger confirmation biases which end up detracting from their work. I do not consider Ezekiel a real historian. He is a countryable YouTuber who likes to think he is a historian, but there is something fundamental lacking in the way he and others on this platform approach history, with shallow analysis, if any, and a stronger interest in how these events fit like a plot in a book more than what we can learn from our past, just like the pop history of yore. And if something isn't done, if we continue rewarding what sounds good and compelling instead of what is accurate and enlightening, our understanding will gradually fade and knowledge gaps will start to form, which just might take us into another dark age. And I wouldn't like that. Have you tried arguing with wearaboos? They're fucking awful.